Here's something I've come to understand after years of watching myself. People don't lose focus because they lack willpower. They lose focus because they never stop to ask who or what their mind is standing guard for. Have you ever sat down to work and just 3 minutes later found your phone already in your hand with no memory of when you picked it up? That's not weakness. That's a war you didn't even know you were fighting. The ancient Romans had no social media, no push notifications, but they understood, with striking clarity, exactly what was stealing the human mind, because the nature of distraction has never changed. Only its tools are new. The 10 truths that follow aren't productivity tips you'll read once and forget within a week. They are how real people, in real and unforgiving circumstances, held onto their clarity of mind. First, guard your mind like a border. Epictetus was born a slave, with no right to choose where he lived or whom he served. By ordinary logic, a man who lost control over nearly every part of his outer life should have been the most hopeless of all. And yet, he became one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western philosophy. Why does that paradox exist? Because he did one very specific thing. He redrew the boundary of what control even means. He drew a sharp line. His status, his possessions, his reputation were never his to decide. But his thoughts, his judgments, his reactions were. And he poured his energy only into what actually belonged to him. This isn't some hollow, feel-good story. It is precisely the mechanism that let a man stripped of physical freedom still hold on to his mental sovereignty. Now hold that up against your own life. You don't control your boss emailing you at 11 p.m. You don't control the cruel comment left under your post. But you do control whether you open that email the second it arrives. If a man who had lost his freedom could still guard that line, what excuse do you have, a person with every right to self-determination, for letting anyone and everyone walk in and out of your mind as they please? Second, cut it away. Don't try to hold on to everything. Seneca was once a close advisor to Nero, one of the most notorious emperors in Roman history. For years, he used that position to restrain the worst parts of Nero's nature. But as time went on, his influence at court kept shrinking while the political risk kept growing. He asked to step back, handed over most of his wealth, and withdrew to live simply and right. What's worth noticing isn't that he walked away from power. Plenty of people do that when they're forced to. What's worth noticing is that he stepped back before circumstances forced him to pay a far steeper price. And before that relationship could keep draining the clarity of mind his philosophical work required. He didn't wait until he was completely burned out to cut it away. That is exactly the difference between cutting away in the Stoic sense and ordinary giving up. Giving up is a reaction to being overwhelmed. Cutting away is a deliberate decision made before everything becomes unsalvageable. Are you holding on to a relationship, a group chat, a habit, not because it still serves you, but simply because you've never once stopped to ask whether it's worth it? Third one thing, fully. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius reminds himself of something very specific. Whatever you're doing, do it as a true Roman, and a grown man would with complete attention, undivided by anything else. He didn't write this during some peaceful retreat. He wrote it in the middle of military campaigns on the northern frontier, where he was both emperor and commander-in-chief, surrounded by dozens of decisions demanding his attention all at once. It's precisely that circumstance that gives his reminder its weight. A man with little on his plate telling you to focus on one thing at a time is easy to say. A man standing in the middle of a battlefield, buried under countless things requiring instant response, still forcing himself back to the principle of one thing at a time, that is proof this principle isn't a luxury reserved for quiet moments. It's a survival tool for when the pressure is at its highest. So the question isn't, do I have enough time to focus on one thing? The question is, if a man commanding an army in the middle of a war could still manage that, is you texting while sitting in a meeting, while scrolling your feed really, because you're too busy, or simply because you've never once forced yourself to choose? Fourth, the people and places you stay close to shape the way you think. In a letter to his student Lucilius, Seneca gives a very specific warning about mixing with a crowd. He says that simply blending into a noisy group, no matter how calm your mind was going in, you'll carry away some of their disorder when you leave the way. Standing near a fire still warms you, even if you never touch it. He isn't offering this as some general observation about society. He's laying it down as a working principle. Choose carefully who and what you allow near your mind. The logic here is plain, though rarely stated outright. You don't have to agree with chaos to catch it. Simply being inside it long enough is enough. This is why willpower alone is never sufficient to hold your focus. If the space around you keeps broadcasting signals of distraction, you're fighting it with willpower every single second. And no one wins that war forever. So instead of asking, how do I get more discipline, ask this. Do the spaces and conversations I'm standing in right now pull my mind toward where I want to go, or in the opposite direction? Fifth, silence is a training ground, not a hiding place. There's record that Marcus Aurelius had a habit of waking early and spending quiet time before the day began, reminding himself that today he would meet ungrateful people, arrogant people, dishonest people, not to be pessimistic, but so that when those things actually happened, he already had a response ready, instead of being blindsided by it. The key lies in the sequence. Stillness comes first, chaos comes after. He wasn't seeking silence to escape a day that had already fallen apart. He used silence like practice before a match, so that when the real match came, the reflexes were already there. Most of us do the opposite. We only reach for stillness once we're already exhausted, once everything has already broken, and by then, it barely trains us anymore. It only serves as an emergency measure. If silence is only a place you hide at the end of the day, how can it ever prepare you from the start of it? If by now you've recognized that you're missing at least one of the 5 things just mentioned, leave a word in the comments. It'll remind you to come back to this, and it'll tell me which one to go deeper on next. Sixth, obstacles aren't the enemy of focus, they're the raw material of it. Back to Epictetus. After years as a slave, he was freed and opened a school of philosophy. But under Emperor Domitian, the entire community of philosophers was expelled from Rome, him included. This was the second time in his life that outside circumstances took away something he had spent years building. If he had chosen to see this as proof that effort was pointless, the story would have ended there. But what he taught about distinguishing what can be controlled from what can't, much of it was distilled directly from these very losses. He didn't overcome adversity and then start teaching. Adversity was the raw material that shaped what he taught. Here's the crucial distinction worth drawing clearly. Adversity doesn't automatically train focus. It only does that if you actively turn it into a question to answer, rather than a reason to stop. So, the last time something difficult happened to you, did you use it as an excuse to put off what matters, or as data to better understand what's actually worth pouring your effort into? Seventh, daily rituals, not passing inspiration. Benjamin Franklin wasn't a Stoic in any formal sense, but the way he ran his life reflected that spirit closely. He kept a small notebook listing 13 virtues he wanted to cultivate, focusing on just one each week, marking down every time he failed. He kept this up for years on end, not because he felt motivated every single day, but because he turned it into a system independent of emotion. Here's the crucial point most people miss when they talk about discipline. Franklin's system never required him to feel ready. It only required him to open the notebook and mark it down, whatever mood he was in. It was precisely because it was detached from emotion that it held up over the long haul, instead of only surviving on the days he happened to feel inspired. If your focus depends entirely on whether you feel full of energy today, it will collapse on exactly the days you need it most. The question isn't, how do I get more motivation? The question is, have you built a structure solid enough to keep running, even on the days motivation doesn't show up? Eighth, the conversation running in your head matters more than you think. Meditations was never actually a book Marcus Aurelius intended to publish. It was notes he wrote to himself to correct his own negative thoughts, to remind himself not to exaggerate problems, not to let anger drive his actions. A man with almost absolute power over an empire still needed to re-edit his own thinking in writing every single day. That reveals something very specific. Outer power is in no way proportional to inner steadiness. If even the man standing at the head of an empire needed a tool to control the current of his own thoughts, then the fact that you let negative thoughts run unchecked isn't because you're somehow weaker than anyone else. It's because you've never once treated re-editing your own thinking as a skill worth practicing the way he did every night. Ninth, enduring small physical discomfort trains you to endure the larger discomfort of the mind. Seneca had a specific practice. A few days each month, even while living comfortably, he would deliberately eat the coarsest food, wear the shabbiest clothes, sleep on a hard floor. The purpose wasn't asceticism. He explains it plainly in a letter to Lucilius. He did it to ask himself, is this really the thing I was so afraid of? And the answer was always no. This was an exercise, not a lifestyle, and that exercise aimed at exactly one target, the fear of discomfort. People tend to think focus is a matter of the mind, but most of the time, the reason you abandon a difficult task halfway through isn't because you're not smart enough to finish it. It's because you can't stand the feeling of discomfort that comes with sitting still for too long, waiting, or repeating something tedious. That's the reflex of avoiding discomfort, and it doesn't distinguish between discomfort from the body and discomfort from work. So when Seneca trained himself to grow used to hunger, cold, and a lack of comfort, he was really training that reflex at its root, teaching himself that discomfort showing up doesn't mean he has to stop right away. Someone used to enduring small physical discomfort will give up far less often when facing the discomfort of staying focused because it's the same reflex, just showing up in a different place. 10th, live as if today is the only day you have the right to focus. Seneca wrote that death doesn't arrive on some fixed day in the future. It began the day we were born, bit by bit, through every day we wasted. He didn't write this to frighten his readers. He wrote it as a plain, straightforward calculation. Add up every day you've postponed what matters while waiting for a more convenient time, and you'll find that most of your life has passed in a state of waiting, not a state of living. This is exactly why putting off focus feels harmless day by day, yet adds up to the greatest loss of a lifetime, because each postponed day doesn't simply vanish, it just shifts into the lost column, never to be refunded. You don't need to think about death every day to understand this. Just ask yourself, if today were the only day you had to do the thing that matters most to you, would you still hand over 3 hours to something you won't even remember the name of by tomorrow morning? These 10 truths aren't a list to read once and check off. Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Franklin, not one of them had a perfect day, free of noise, free of being pulled off course. Their difference never lay in avoiding distraction. It lay in having a clear system of reasons, not just willpower, so that every time they got pulled away, they knew exactly why they needed to come back. The real question was never how long you can focus. It's this: today, who, Or what are you about to let borrow your mind first? Answer that question right in the comments. Put it into words, because something you only think stays easy to forget, but something you've typed out is much harder to ignore. And if this is the channel you want to come back to next time you need a clearer perspective, follow along. It's the simplest way for me to know where to dig deeper next.